Hi everyone. Today I have come with the next video of mine, that is we'll be talking about sexual reproduction in plants. Today we'll be talking of plants. In my last video we had talked about asexual mode of reproduction. We had talked about the lower organisms which follow asexual mode of reproduction like Spirogyra, amoeba, then yours planaria, and all those. And we had also learnt about the vegetative modes of propagation which are followed in plants. It is some man-made vegetative propagation like layering and all, grafting, layering. And we have also talked about the natural vegetative propagation that takes place, that is bulb, stolon, etc. So today we'll be starting about sexual reproduction. When I had talked about asexual reproduction, I had told you that when you talk about the difference between sexual and asexual reproduction, the basic difference in sexual and asexual reproduction is, in sexual reproduction, it involves two parents. It has to have two types or two different parents. That is, one has to be a male and another has to be a female. And the process of sexual reproduction is a longer time, takes a long time to complete a process of sexual reproduction. It depends on many chances, many factors and many things for the sexual reproduction to take place, and it always happens in higher organisms. Even in plants, when we see the sexual reproduction taking place, we see it mostly for the angiosperm, which is the most highly evolved plants among all the plants of the plant kingdom. If we go through the plants, the angiosperms are the most and the highly evolved plants. So mostly sexual reproduction are being seen or is being noticed for the plants. If it is seen, it is for the angiosperm. So when we talk about in sexual reproduction, the first thing we'll understand, how does the sexual reproduction takes place, or what actually happens, or how the plant or a particular body prepares itself for sexual reproduction. How does it do that? So when we'll go to start, the first thing we'll talk about when it is sexual reproduction, I told you it involves two parents. It involves two different parents. One has to be a male and another has to be a female. One has to be a male and the female. Now when I have talked about it, I will be talking, because sexual reproduction, I told you, it always occurs in higher organisms and it is a more complex procedure than that of asexual mode of reproduction. So sexual mode of reproduction, here I have mentioned 2N. Here I have mentioned the word 2N. What is that 2N? That 2N, it actually signifies the chromosome number, or the chromosome number of the particular element or particular organism. The male also has the 2N chromosome number and the female also has a 2N chromosome number. And the resultant that we get, the zygote that develops, or the final, after fertilization, the zygote or the new one which is born, it is also 2N. That is also 2N. So if it is 2N, this is 2N, and it again combines and forms 2N. How is that possible? So this is again possible, or this takes place, or this happens due to the presence of a special type of cell division that takes place. Cell division, we all know about it, that cell division are of two types. One, that is a normal cell division, that is cell replicates itself by the process of meiosis. The process of meiosis, there is no reduction of the chromosome number. But for sexual reproduction, these cells, when the sexual reproduction has to take place, or when a body or a plant prepares itself for sexual reproduction, it undergoes another special type of cell division which is known as meiosis. Here you can see this 2N, it undergoes the process of meiosis and it gives rise to a special kind of cells which are suited or which are prepared only for sexual reproduction, to undergo sexual reproduction, and they are called gametes. These gametes are again of two types based on the male and the female. They have male gamete and female gametes. These male and the female gametes that is formed, it is only formed after the process of meiosis. That particular cell becomes haploid in chromosome number. It becomes haploid in number. It gets a chromosome number of N. It gets divided into half of the chromosome number than its parent cell. The parent cell was male, was 2N. It gets divided into half of the number, that is N. If it is for human beings, we know that human beings consists of 46 pair of chromosomes. They consist of 23 pairs, it consists of 23 pairs of chromosomes. That is, total number is 46. When it undergoes meiosis, it gives rise, the gametes consist of only 23 chromosomes. That is, only the half of the chromosome number is there. So these male gametes consist of N number of chromosomes, or the number of chromosomes is N, that is half the number of the parent cell, and even the female also gets reduced to half of the parent number, that is, it comes to N. This male gamete is called a sperm. This male gamete is called a sperm, and the female gamete, what we talk about, is called an egg. The male gamete is produced in testis, whereas the female gamete is produced in ovary. Because it occurs in a highly developed or higher animals or higher plants, so the name of the special cells that takes part in sexual reproduction is different. The chromosome number becomes half. It is produced in different types of organs or different sex organs. It is produced, basically the sex organs are named differently in male as well as in female. It is not only for humans, even in plants also the similar procedure is followed, or the similar part or the similar procedure takes place. And finally, this male and the female gamete fuse together. They fuse together, or they get fertilized together and form the zygote, which is again coming to 2N, that is that of the initial male or the female. It again gives rise or comes to 2N. Here you can see this 2N gets divided into N. It is due to the process of meiosis. Even here also due to the process of meiosis, and it gives rise to sperm. This gives rise to sperm, so it is called spermatogenesis, and this gives rise to egg, so it is called oogenesis. That process through which it gives rise is called oogenesis. And finally, one egg and one sperm, they fuse together to give rise to a zygote, and this zygote is again 2N in number, that is, again it is diploid in number. From the haploid, it has again become diploid, taking half of the chromosome from, or half the cell number from that of the male and half from that of the female. So if this is clear, we'll move on to the next slide, or we'll talk about the next thing. So we'll talk about what is sexual reproduction. What is sexual reproduction? So we have learned, or we have understood, that sexual reproduction involves two parents, that is, one has to be a male and the other has to be a female, and each of these parents produces a special type of cells called the gametes, and they are both different from each other. That is the male gamete and the female gamete, and they are also known as sperm or the egg. It takes place mostly in the higher plants and animals. What I have just told you before, these are the points, or these are the special characteristics that takes places, or that is a part of sexual reproduction. Now, what does sexual reproduction give rise to? The sexual reproduction gives rise to a new offspring, where in this offspring we can see a variation. It has to be different. It is because it involves both the male and the female, so the offspring that is developed, the offspring that is formed, it is not exactly like the mother or the father or the male or the female. It has some variations from both of them, and this is the basis of evolution. This is very much required for the basis of evolution. If you remember in my last video also, when we were talking, I had told you that sexual or reproduction brings about variation, which is very much necessary for evolution or for maintenance of life to continue in this world. And this process of sexual reproduction takes place, but the chromosome number is always maintained. It is not that due to the fusion of the male and the female, it is not that the doubling of the chromosome takes place. So if it get double, means every time it will get double, and the offsprings would have got immense huge number of chromosomes, which is just not possible, which is feasibly not possible. So the nature, to maintain everything at its constant, it undergoes a special type of cell division. These cells undergoes a special type of cell division called meiosis, and this meiosis leads to the formation of half the number of the cells, half the number of the cell number or the chromosome number, and this undergoes sexual reproduction. So the zygote again comes back or gets the original cell or the chromosome number. So when we talk about the sexual reproduction in plants, first we have to know, or first what comes into our mind, that sexual reproduction in plants takes place in a flower. The flower is that reproductive part of the plant, or it is a reproductive part of the angiospermic plant. These flowers are either, they are called bisexual when they have both the male and the female part in the same flower, or they are unisexual when they have only one, either male or the female in the flower. So based on what portion or what reproductive part is there in the flower, the flowers are termed as either unisexual flower or bisexual flower. So when the sexual reproduction takes place in flower, it forms or it undergoes or it goes onto some of the processes. It follows some processes. The first step that in a flower it takes place, or the sexual reproduction, the starting point of the sexual reproduction starts with pollination, then leading on to the germination of the pollen, then fertilization followed by double fertilization, and finally the formation of the seeds and the fruits. So let us first talk about, or let us first know about pollination. So this is the structure or the structure of a complete flower. When we have a flower with both the sexes, that is both the male and the female part, we tell that flower is a complete flower. It is not an incomplete flower. And flower with one type, either the female reproductive part or the male reproductive part, is called an incomplete flower. But this flower consisting of both the ovary or both the female reproductive part as well as the male reproductive part, we call it as a complete flower. Now when we talk of a complete flower, this is the female reproductive part. It is the gynoecium. It is called the gynoecium, or it is also known as a carpel. The gynoecium consists of the ovary. The ovary consists of the ovules and the style, and finally the stigma. So basically it is the stigma, this is the style, and this is the ovary that constitutes or contains the ovules, and this is the female reproductive part. This is where the seed formation takes place, and this is the male reproductive part. What happens in the male reproductive part consists of an anther and the filament, and this anther is a globostructure which consists of this microsporangia. This microsporangia is actually, they are very minute structures which consist of the pollen grains. These pollen grains are the sperms that we are taking off, which actually go and fuse with that of the ovules in the ovary. This is the male reproductive part, and this is the female reproductive part. So the first step that takes place during the process of sexual reproduction is pollination. Pollination means what I have told you, this pollens from the microsporangia or the female reproductive part, that is from the anther. These pollens, they are the male, this needs to go and settle itself on this stigma. This pollen needs to go and settle itself onto the stigma. Then that is pollination that needs to happen for a sexual fusion to take place, for the fusion between the male and the female gametes to take place. So what happens, this pollens from the anther, it comes and it settles itself on the stigma. Now if this pollens from the same flower comes and settles itself on the stigma of the same flower, then it is called self-pollination. It is called self-pollination, that is, it pollinates among themselves. It pollinates among the anther or the pollen from the same flower, settles into the stigma of the same flower. But if the pollen of this flower goes and puts onto the stigma of another flower, it is called a cross-pollination. It is called a cross-pollination because the flowers are different. The pollen from one flower goes and settles on the pollen on the stigma or the stigma of the other flower. So this is called pollination. So what is pollination? It is the act of transferring pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of the same flower in the process of self-pollination, or the pollen of one flower goes and feeds to the stigma of another flower through the process of cross-pollination. And the goal is to create a new offspring or new generation. So once the pollen has gone and sat on the style of the gynoecium, that is here, it has reached here. It has reached this pollen grains comes and sits on the stigma of the flower or stigma of the female reproductive part. This pollen starts to grow in a tube-like structure. This tube helps in transferring of the pollen or the movement of the nuclei from the stigma into the ovary. From the stigma into the ovary, the pollen nuclei of the pollen needs to migrate from the stigma to the ovary, and this takes place through these tubes that is formed. This is called the pollen. Germination of the pollen takes place. Next, once the pollen germinates, the pollen tube comes and meets here to that of the ovum, and this is the process of fertilization. So what is fertilization? It is a process of sexual reproduction which occurs after the pollination as well as the germination of the pollen. It can be defined as the fusion of the male gametes with that of the female gametes to form the diploid zygote. Why diploid zygote? Because again it comes to 2n in number. Now when we are talking about sexual reproduction in plants, the higher plants like that of angiosperm, we always come to, or we always hear we always get to hear about a term called double fertilization. Now exactly what is double fertilization, or what happens during the process of double fertilization? Why is it called double fertilization? We have just talked about fertilization, but why it is double fertilization? Now double fertilization is a complex process. Because it is double fertilization, it is called because we can have an idea that double fertilization means there are two fertilizations taking place in the same embryo sac. It is two fertilizations that is taking place, that was simultaneously in the embryo sac, and might be because of that they are calling it a double fertilization. Now what happens once the pollen sits on the stigma and the pollen tube starts forming? The pollen tube nuclei, it starts migrating and comes and fertilizes itself with that of the egg. Comes and fertilizes itself with that of the egg. The pollen tube nuclei, it comes and fertilizes the pollen nuclei of the central cell with that of the egg. So it is one fertilization, and this becomes 2n in number, that is one from the pollen nuclei and one from the egg cell. It forms 2n in number and gives rise to the zygote. One sperm fertilizes the egg cell and the other sperm combines with the polar nuclei of the large central cell of the megametophyte. This is also called a megametophyte because it is the place where the process of fertilization takes place, the seed formation takes place. It is also called as the megametophyte. Now the two nuclei, the two pollen nuclei that has come into, one comes and fuses with this egg cell forming the 2N, and the other nuclei comes and fuses with this pollen nuclei, comes and fuses itself with this pollen nuclei. You can see the haploid sperm and the haploid egg combine to form a diploid zygote, which I told you it will come and fuse with this egg cell to form a diploid zygote or the 2N, and the process is called a syngamy. While the other sperm that was there, because each of the pollens has two nucleus, it undergoes fusion with this of the polar nuclei or the middle cell, forming a triploid or triple nucleus or triple fusion, forming a triple fusion or a triploid nucleus, because here itself there were two nucleus, polar nuclei were two, and it got fused with another sperm nuclei forming a triple fusion. In some plants there are also polyploid nuclei are there. Instead of 3, it becomes many in number, and the large cell of the gametophyte, now it transforms itself into an endosperm. The endosperm, when you see of this forms the embryo, and this that fuses together and form the triplet nuclei, this forms the endosperm. What is that endosperm? That endosperm stores the food for this embryo. When this germinates, or when this seed comes into being, when this seed starts a new generation, this germinates, it requires food to germinate, or food for the process of germination, that is then provided by this part, this polar nuclei, the fusion of the polar nuclei with that of the sperm of the pollen, and it forms the endosperm, which provides food for this developing embryo. So is this clear? Because two fertilization takes place, this process is called a double fertilization. This process is known as double fertilization. One fertilization takes place with that of the egg cell and the sperm cell of the pollen, and the other fertilization that takes place, this is the polar nuclei, this is a double nucleated polar nuclei with that of the another sperm of the pollen, and this is a triple fusion, this is a double fusion giving rise to a 2N, that is a diploid zygote, and this gives rise to 3N. This forms the endosperm, this forms the embryo. Now if we are talking about the ovary and the ovule, everything is formed. Now what is the fate of the flower? What happens to the flower that was there with such a vibrant colors, so many other different parts of the flowers? Actually what happened, the stamens, the style, the petals, the stigma, they all dry and they wither off from the flower. Sometimes the apicalyx or the sepals that is there in the flower, if you remember, this is the sepal. This is the sepal of the flower. This sometimes remains off. This does not wither off. This does not dry and wither off. And so this part of the stamens may be there. This part of the sepal may be there. The calyx may either remain intact or may be dry, or they may also be removed. The ovary, it enlarges to form the fruit, and the ovarian walls from the fruit outer covering, the fruit wall, the fruit coat, and the ovule develops into a seed. Each seed contains of a tiny plant which needs to develop under favorable conditions. So you must remember that the ovary develops into a fruit while the ovule develops into a seed. Then when these seeds from the ovule under favorable environmental conditions, these seeds also they germinate or they give rise to a new plant, and this process of giving rise of a new plant under favorable condition is known as germination. This is a seed under favorable condition. this starts to grow. First thing that comes out, that is one hypocotyl and the radicle. This radicle slowly forms the root or the root system, and slowly this hypocotyl enlarges and it forms the shoot. It gives rise to the shoot. This hypocotyl grows and it gives to the shoot. This, and slowly the leaves start to come out. This happens during the stages of germination, that is under favorable conditions, when the seeds grow into a new plant, that is a new generation of the plant come into being. So just let us have a quick glance or a quick look about the life cycle of the plant in angiosperms. So what happens, this is a flower. This is a complete flower having both the male and the female part. This is the anther. The anther gives rise to the microspore mother cell. It undergoes meiosis. If you remember, it undergoes meiosis and it gives rise to this pollen. This pollen, when it comes in contact with that of the stigma or the female reproductive part or female reproductive organ, this sits on the stigma and slowly it starts developing the pollen tube. This pollen tube reaches the ovary or reaches the megametophyte. On reaching this megametophyte, the pollen has two nucleus. One of the nucleus goes and fuses with the egg, giving rise to the zygote, which is diploid in number, and the other nuclei fuses with that of the polar nuclei, giving rise to triple fusion. This triple fusion nuclei later forms into endosperm, and this truce and this egg along with the sperm nuclei, it forms the zygote. This forms the zygote, and after this, and it forms the seed. This seed is under favorable conditions again germinates and give rise to a new plant. Under favorable conditions, they give rise to a new plant. So this is all about the sexual reproduction in plants that takes place in the higher organisms or higher plants like that of the angiosperm. It is mandatory to have the female and the male reproductive parts, as well as some special type of cell division, some special type of cells. It undergoes a reduction in the cell number, it undergoes a reduction of the chromosome number. Again, it forms a zygote. It prepares itself for the next generation. It prepares the next generation, which is much more evolved than the parental generation, and this evolution is very much necessary to carry on the process of life, to stay in this world, to stay or to fight and to be there in this world. So this is all about sexual reproduction that takes place in plants, especially in the higher plants like that of the angiosperms. In my next video, I'll be coming with the sexual reproduction in humans. If you have liked my video, please like, share and subscribe to my channel, and I'll be coming back with the next video of sexual reproduction in humans. Thank you.